And good evening to everyone from around the world who is joining us in this webinar this afternoon. My name is Paul LeClerc, and I'm honored to be the director of the Columbia Global Center in Paris at Reed Hall. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar on a truly timely topic: Is Europe democratic? This webinar is the fourth in a monthly series of broadcasts devoted to exploring 6 broad top issues of concern that will indeed perhaps define the very future of Europe. Each month in our series, one specific topic is considered twice, once in a Francophone format through an interview with a single individual expert in Europe, and those are filmed in Paris. And then one in an Anglophone conversation between a group of experts located both at the University in New York as well as colleagues in Europe. This really important series was created by 3 Columbia University organizations: the Paris Global Center, the European Institute, and the Alliance Program, and in cooperation with our colleague formerly of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Thierry Grier, who conducts the Francophone interviews. I'm delighted to welcome all of our distinguished panelists this afternoon, and especially pleased to introduce and to welcome the panelist moderator, Yves Mény, who's been my friend and colleague. Yves, I hope you don't mind if I admit to this, for close to half a century. Yves Mény is one of the most prominent and distinguished and prolific political scientists in Europe today. He began his career 50 years ago when I met him in Rennes as a professor of political science. He then moved to Paris, where he had faculty appointments at Assas, Paris Assas, and at Sciences Po. From there, he went to the European University Institute in Florence, where he created a research center on European affairs, the Robert Schuman Institute, and he finally ascended to the lofty position of being the president of the European University Institute, a post which he held for 8 years from 2002 to 2010. The titles of Professor Mény's publications, books alone, not articles, take up 3 pages on Amazon Books today. They focus on comparable politics and institutions, on democratic issues, especially relevant to us today, issues such as populism, democracy, and corruption. His latest book, Imperfect Democracies, was first published recently in France and has already been translated into Italian and Portuguese. And very, very soon, Roman Littlefield will release it in English. Yves, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now turn the program over to you to introduce your colleagues on today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your invitation and for setting this very nice panel of experts, but also for some of them friends or new friends from today. So we are here to discuss with 4 panelists, and I will start with Nadia Urbinati, who is a political theorist who teaches in New York, and by the way, who is also an alumna of the European University Institute, and I'm pleased to recognize that we alumni have really done very well in many parts of the world. And she's a political theorist who has worked extensively on the issue of democracy and representative government. In particular, she has published books on democracy disfigured, or more recently in 2019, a book which is a very fascinating book with a marvelous title, Me, the People. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful title, which tells a lot about our times. Then we have Ivan Krastev, who works in Sofia, where he's the director of the Center for Liberal Strategies. He's also a prolific publisher on democratic issues, and is well known of media in Europe and in the United States. His most recent publications include The Light That Failed and also After Europe, which has a new edition in 2020. Then we have two academics who have a special qualities. They have also been practitioners in one way or the other. Luuk van Middelaar from Netherlands is a philosopher, a political theorist, but he has also been in the staff of the first president of the European Council from 2009 to 2014. And he has published extremely interesting books which are at the crossroads between theory and observation of the practice. Passage to Europe is the first one, and Alarums and Excursions, Improvising on the European Stage is the most recent publications. Finally, Rui Tavares, who is joining us from Portugal, from Lisbon, is a former MEP. So he has strong experience in European politics, and he has been in particular in charge of a report on the problem of rule of law and in Hungary. That was published in 2013. If I'm not wrong, he has also been a visiting fellow in the United States, and he might be able to observe from the spot in Portugal both the strengths of Portuguese politics, but also the worm which is in the fruit since last Sunday. An extreme right leader has got, for the first time in Portugal, 12% of the popular vote, which is an indication of how democratic systems are shaken by the present in the present times. So I would like to propose to our speakers to divide the time in three parts. And the first part would be to try to set a standard, because the question is Europe democratic? And if we wish to apply a standard to Europe, we have to define the kind of standard we wish to apply. So I will turn first to Nadia, and I will ask her, if you wish to evaluate the democratic intensity of the European Union, what kind of criteria would apply? What is your definition of democracy?
Thank you for having me here, and thank you for this lovely presentation by Yves Mény. Well, intensity. Intensity sometimes is connected to the perception of the citizens, and sometimes is connected to the delivery or the output of the institutions. I would like to go to the so-called to the basic elements that make us recognize a democracy when we see it somehow. So how can we recognize it when we see it? And I think that the modern tradition gave us some important reference points. First of all, a constitution. I know that it's very complex as a problem. Some countries don't have written constitutions, but most of European countries in the continent, they have a constitutions. And this constitution is divided in two parts, generally, both physically and either physically or not, meaning a list of rights which are supposed not to be infringed by cyclical majorities or governments, and the system of and the descriptions and the system concerning institutions, limitations of their own functions, and finally the domains of political actions can be the social or not. So it's a kind of pact that citizens, better saying parties, they have signed in different moments of their history. They've changed through history, but constitution is connected to democracy in modern time. The other important element of democracy is representation, which cannot be today, democracy cannot be even conceived today without a system of electoral, cyclical, regular, a system that produces representations, and representations translates into seats in a parliament or in a Congress, which has a specific power, the power of lawmaking. Thus, this makes the institutional side of the story deeply connected to the extra-institutional side of the story, because representation is a kind of zip that on the one hand links and on the other hand shakes the relationship between institutions and the citizens. Now, these are very important. So in some sense, institution is so elastic because it presumes a permanent going forward between opinions and decision-making, between so-called moral legitimacy and legal legitimacy. So it's very crucial. So how can we then apply this concept to Europe? Now, the EU is certainly an object of contestation.
Nadia,
yeah.
may I interrupt you for a moment?
Yeah.
Because I would like to ask your colleagues
sorry.
to join you or to dissent or to complement before that we tackle the EU issue.
Okay. Just then I want simply to end with leaving aside the EU, and by saying that democracy is both a form of government, institutional organization, procedures of decision making, and a system of opinion formations that pushes or reflect or direct and sometimes react against decisions coming from institutions. So these two legs, they make democracy a complex system made of both institutional domains and procedural and the broad, not organized or standardized domain that we call sphere of opinion formation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, do you agree? Do you concur? Do you dissent?
I want to start with the fact that the question, is Europe democratic, starts with the assumption that we know what is a democracy on the level of the nation state, but we are questioning what exactly does it mean on the European level. And on the level of the nation state, I do believe that I'll stay very much to the most minimalist definition coming from Przeworski, and which I do believe basically gets exactly these key features that we're talking about. Democracy is a political system in which incumbent can lose elections, and after losing elections is going to leave power. Because the very fact that the incumbent can lose elections basically suppose certain level of competition that is functioning. And secondly, you have elections. And thirdly, if you have elections, you can lose elections. And of course, this was questions for several hours in the United States recently. After losing elections, there is no kind of a guarantee that you're going to lose office. And I do believe these three things are quite important when we ask the question, what democracy means in terms of government, how basically people are making choices. But I very much agree with Nadia that for the people, when you're going to ask a citizen what is a democracy, he basically is answering a slightly different question. To what extent I have the feeling that I can influence any type of decision in a political community to which I belong.
Okay, thank you. I will finish with Rui because he will make the natural connection between the definition of democracy and the European Union, since he is a former member of the European Parliament. So Luuk, you are both a philosopher and you have been part of the executive of the European Union, but as we know, the executive in the European Union is also a lawmaker. So can you give your opinion?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
Thank you, Yves, for the introduction and for hosting us here to all. I agree with the wise things which already have been said by Nadia and Ivan just now, and in particular also on the importance of being able to kick people out of office. This element of change, I think, is very important, which also means that if we zoom out first before zooming into your question, that democracy is a political system that is, or at least can be, good at adapting to changed circumstances because it has the possibility to change its leadership when it wants to. And of course, a very famous historic example is when in I think it was the summer of 1945, the British electorate decided to vote Winston Churchill, the great war hero, out of office because the war was over and they now needed somebody else. They needed somebody who could, in that case, build a welfare state. So that is a very strong feature of democracies as political systems, this capacity to create organized ruptures and discontinuities which are not completely upsetting the system as a whole. But of course, that indeed points to a difficulty within the European Union, to which we will then, if I understand correctly, come later. But that is that there is no clear, identifiable government in the EU, no clear executive. There are a number of institutions of which one can say that they are part of the executive, the Commission, no doubt, the European Council as well, the leaders, some other bodies as well, but let's not get into the details. But it is impossible to vote all of them out of office at the same time, because the European Union is not a state, but a club of states with all their own national elections, to which we will also come later. So you cannot achieve this element of a great discontinuity. Now, is this a weakness or is this a strength? How many checks and balances do you need within a system? As Ivan mentioned, we have also just witnessed some checks and balances in the US political and government system between the various branches of government. Perhaps in the EU, there's too many checks and balances and not enough possibility for the voters, for citizens to achieve that change either, and I will conclude there, by visibly changing the direction of policies or very visibly change political personnel as a direct consequence of a vote. I will stop here, but we can take it up later.
Well, certainly at a time where charismatic leaders tend to dominate the stage, it's for sure the European Union is not the place where you have a single leader dominating the other institution, as it might happen in national settings. So, Rui, you have an experience as a parliamentarian. Are you part of these frustrated policymakers who consider that the European Parliament has not enough power, not enough influence, and that actually is not the equivalent of national parliaments, for instance?
Oh, thank you very much, Yves. Well, actually, I'm not one of the most pessimistic or frustrated either members or former members of the European Parliament regarding that question, the comparison with national parliaments. I think that there's also a question about national democracy today, that it's, you know, the EU is indeed a club of democracies, each with its virtues and vices. But the question is not only for the EU to resemble national democracies, be as democratic as member states, but in a sense to be more democratic even than member states. I think that the problem starts with having a definition of democracy that is too thin. And I'll start by remembering that the EU itself had a definition of democracy in the epigraph to the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe, because it quoted Thucydides, and it said, our constitution is called a democracy because not only the few, but the whole or the majority of the people govern. There's a question, a controversy regarding if it's the whole or the majority. And that definition, that was enough for ancient democracy and would today be subscribed by someone as little democratic as Mr. Viktor Orban, for instance. He thinks that the democracy is the regime where the majority rules, is not enough for us to ascertain what a democracy is. I like a definition by a medieval thinker on democracy, Al-Farabi, who is the missing link between ancient and modern democracy, the missing link between Aristotle and Plato on one side and then the Renaissance on the other. And he says about democracy, a democracy is a group of people who agree to have virtuous ideas, we can say a constitution, who live close to one another in a place. There's a certain contiguity of experience. It can be wall to wall, i.e. in a city, but it can be tent to tent, i.e. in a caravan. It can be in a boarding house or in a home. So even a family home can be a democracy, if we so wish. It can be at the top of a mountain. It can be underground. We can build democracy if we decide to build democracy. Then he says, a democratic city is a collective city in which the citizens' the goal is to be free, each of them doing what they wish without encumbrance. And a democratic city, differently from the oligarchic city, the aristocratic city, the plutocratic city, is a city that does not live according to one principle, to one ambition, he says, but is a city in which there is a coexistence of all the ambitions, all the different organizing principles that each of us has in his or her head, have to coexist and mold the political experience of the city, meaning that each of one will have a different definition. And because you wanted me to
plea for pluralism,
and of course it has to be a pluralistic city, and pluralism itself has to be pluralistic. It's not only the pluralism of the market, for instance, but it has to coexist with other guiding principles for pluralism. So in order to give a link to the EU experience, there's quite a big difference between a contrast between answering, is Europe democratic, which it can be, and is Europe a democracy? So there's a difference between democracy as an adjective. We can say that the EU is democratic enough, but the EU is not a democracy. And I'll even say that the key word here is a, if it's a single noun. Whereas the United States is a little bit the opposite, if we think about it. Nobody is in any doubt that the United States are a democracy, meaning a single polity that is a democracy. But if we read the criticism of US democracy, we'll hear that many people consider that the United States are not democratic, because the big challenge for the United States is to create a multiracial democracy, which arguably the United States haven't achieved yet. And what we have to think is what is the equivalent challenge for Europe? Europe may well be democratic, or a club of 27 democracies with virtues and vices, but Europe still is not a democracy, meaning a transnational democracy, which will be the equivalent challenge at the European level to the challenge in the US of creating a multiracial democracy. In the past, if I may add this, it was quite evident for some writers that Europe was already a polity. You know, you read Voltaire in the Siècle de Louis XIV, and the very first page, he says, Europe is a great republic shared by many states. But today, we do not have the impression that Europe is a polity. we have the impression that Europe is an organization composed of polities. So that is the challenge, to create not a democratic Europe, but to create an Europe that is a democracy.
Well, we have a strong proposition on the table, and I would turn again to Luuk this time and to ask him if he agrees with this proposal that Europe is not a democracy, but on the whole, Europe is democratic. Is it a definition that you could live with, or have you a different view, in particular, given your own experience also within the European institutions?
Well, let me then try to recapitulate. So Europe is not a democracy. I would agree with that, because you, Rui, you seem to mean that since Europe is not a state, it is not a single political unity, it cannot be a democracy. So the question of the status, the state features of the European Union seem to be included. And if you say, and that's the second element, it's more forward-looking, the teleological part of your proposition, Europe should become a democracy, then we are entering a discussion of whether Europe also should become a state. And then we enter a whole field on what that means, not only constitutionally speaking, but what it means for the democracies in the plural in the European Union. Let's say, what does it mean for the national democracies, and therefore also for the quality of democratic life in the European Union as a whole, if we have a democracy, let's say at the federal level, to keep it simple, but perhaps with the cost of suffocating the national democracies, which are also very important for the democratic self-understanding of citizens as having and being part of the government. So I think that's a tricky balance there.
Don't you think, Luuk and Rui, that by, in a way, accepting or requesting that there is a fit between state and democracy, we fall into the trap of I would say, the Westphalian paradigm, that is a state is autonomous, is a nation, and actually democracy developed, historically speaking, within that framework, within that shell, and that by stating that in order to have a full-fledged democracy, we must have all the conditions which were requested or required for the national settings, and that we enter into the kind of discussion which was also put forward by the German Constitutional Court. There is no possible democracy in Europe because there is no European demos. If there is no demos, a single demos, there is no democracy. And I see that Nadia is a bit nervous, and I would give her the floor to react to the two previous presentations.
If I may just
yes.
to nuance, so that would be a reason to drop the noun for now and focus again on the adjective for our discussion, because otherwise we will be trapped in this dilemma. Although, final footnote, I don't know whether we are trapped in the Westphalian system or whether the whole world is falling back into it and that we may as well adapt to it. Good.
Yeah. Okay, Nadia. We don't hear you.
So I was not nervous, but I was thinking within my head. And yes, fortunately, you could see through my face, I'm not a good pokerist, poker player, so myself. Now, the issue here is crucial because you see, as soon as we start talking about democracy in Europe, we have to drop something, to change something else, to specify something else, because it is really a strange animal, Europe, that does not fit our nation-state-based conception of democracy. So even the word constitution with which I started is problematic, because we have actually in Europe a kind of constitution, which is very functionalist, tells us is a kind of path toward some specific goal, but doesn't allow any kind of principle of sovereignty, like in the national level. So Europeans have many things in common, but there is not a nation or not a people, not a demos called Europe. So can we have a democracy without these two Westphalian or nation states? This is the real issue today. So I would propose thus to move the discussion toward forms of federalization of states, or more than club does, simply a little bit more than a club and less than a nation state, although federalized a la US. Is it possible to imagine a EU as a community? I don't know what does it mean, but it's a very medieval medieval concept in a federalistic way, because federation allows us to do many things, to have a diversification in relation to the single member states, although not too much, and to put limits on what is each single member states can do with this political system. We can have different culture and accept this idea of pluralism, of course, in a more stringent way. And above all, we can have a very important issue we have to pay attention to, a combination of different size. Big states, small states, deeper populated states, less populated states. How can we manage to live together, although there are so different intensity of power, and power in terms of quantification of territory and population? So we have to find a way to put the small in a condition of seeing themselves not losing power, or in power if they combine with the bigger. And this is the most important issue in my view. And one way of solving that issue has been to use unanimity. That is to give the power to even one to block everything. But this is not a democratic procedure, because it is a democracy in decision making wants majority. Veto or unanimity gives the power to a minority. The minority is capable to block the decision. So that is a very contradictory way. How can we call democratic a system that allows a minority, even one, to block the majority? So that is an issue to be paid attention to. The Americans have solved the problems with the two chambers and adapting the Senate to the equalization of membership, and moving to the House all the diversification of power through parties. Now, is Europe going to accept this solution or not? Or is always ready to stay within this situation, which is, I would call it a kind of social federalization, subsidiarity, but not political federalization. So this I would like to pose as a problem to my interlocutors, particularly those who are politicians, in some sense.
Ivan, you are the director of a center for the, I would say, the promotion of liberal values, liberalism. So we have not yet talked about this important component of democracy, which is, by the way, not only not democratic as such, but we have also to confess that most of the liberal values which have been inserted in democracies had as a goal, as a target, the limitation of the pure democratic will of the people. It was a balance of the pure will of the people. So how do you see this mix which constitutes the essence of democracy, but brought forward to the EU level?
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much agree with the fact that, in a certain way, European Union is much more liberal than democratic, because you basically have a respect for the rights of the minority. You basically have an assumption that all European citizens are going to have the same rights in the different parts of the Union. What you don't have, because the idea of the liberal democracy, basically, I'm going to simplify, assumes three types of things, and they're slightly different. One, in the way that we know the liberal democracies these days, is the right of private property. The second is the right of the majority to govern. And the third, which is the most rare right, is the right of the minority basically to have rights, to feel equally protected. And I do believe that what European Union is offering is the rights of the minority to have rights. And from this point of view, it was quite important. What it is not giving is basically the right of the majority to govern, because the idea of the majority in the European Union has a very different definition. What is it? Majority of states, majority of people. And I'm saying this because normally we're going to agree, and the colleagues basically have made these points very clearly, that the very existence of the European Union is pushing us to change our definition of democracy. But strangely enough, the very existence of the European Union is pushing also us to change the notion of democracy on the level of the nation state. The nation states within the European Union are not democracy in the way the states outside of the European Union are, because many of the decisions cannot be taken by the majority and the decision of the majority of the voters. And I do believe these tensions between the liberal principle and the majoritarian principle, not by accident, it is strong everywhere, and we can see it everywhere, basically the rise of majoritarianism, but in the European Union, it is very well articulated. And I'm just going to give you one example to try to show how the existence of the European Union is making it really difficult for us to try to rethink all these debates. For example, imagine that, for example, in places like Austria, there's 30% of the foreigners who are living in the country, many of them members of the other EU member states, who do not have the right to vote on the European elections, on the Austrian national elections, regardless of the fact that they're paying their taxes in Austria. And on the other side, I have the right to vote on the Bulgarian elections, while being in Austria, I'm not paying the taxes there. So strangely enough, this kind of how you're defining political community, this type of a much more integrated idea of democracy, where basically no taxation without representation and so on, all these kind of a classical concepts, in my view, is questioned both on the level of European Union, but also on the level of the nation state. And I do believe here is the kind of a major tension. Classically, empires can offer rule of law, and they can offer rule of laws of a very diverse communities. They make people equal in front of the law. What they're not giving people is basically the feeling of the majority rules. What the nation state was very good at giving is that majority rules, quite often at the expense of the minorities. It was much more difficult to give this type of a liberal principle. And I do believe that part of the crisis that you see in the European Union today is very much the tensions between the liberal principle and democratic principle. And when you go basically and talk about developments of some of the different European Union member states, you're going to see that probably this is the divide that we're going to decide also the future of the Union.
But this would be a question for each of you, since we are following even discussing the, let's say, the mix which compose all democracies, the mix between, let's say, the will of the people on one hand, the direct expression of the will of the people, and liberal components which are of various nature, from division of power, checks and balances, rule of law, protection of human rights, attribution of powers to independent authorities or judges or central bankers, etc. So we have a mixed bag, and we perfectly know that this mixed bag is different from one polity to the other. American democracy is not the British democracy, which is not the German democracy, etc. So could we accept not to replicate the national model, which, by the way, is so different from one country to the other, and accept the idea that the mix could be slightly different and unique because we are working at the European level. So the question is not so much of a democratic deficit as it was stated by David Markham in the 70s, but a different democratic setting, a different democratic and evolving setting, because democracy is an evolving system. Look, you have experience within the technostructure of the European Union. So
yes, this tension is very palpable. Huh? And I think really we are getting here into the heart of the matter, this tension between the liberal principles and functionalist principles as well, which Nadia mentioned before, on the one hand, and the will of the people, or the majoritarian principle on the other hand. And I think really, well, we are saying it, but we cannot stress enough that the EU has really been built from the start almost exclusively on the liberal functionalist principles. In the mind of the sacred founding fathers, there was no word for democracy. They didn't care. Of course, people also in the French context, like quoting Jean Monnet, who famously said, and then I do a tremolo in my voice, that we should not unite or build coalitions between states, but we should unite les hommes, the people. But he was not talking at all about democracy or about the voters. He was talking about the guys he knew. He was talking about networks he had in Paris and Bonn and New York as well, and Washington. So that is really the DNA of the European Union. There is not a democratic element. And the deal European citizens got out of this, with the EU that has been built, with all these independent institutions you mentioned, I think was an acceptable deal, perhaps until 15, 20 years ago. But as the European Union is entering more and more controversial, deeply political policy fields, a currency, a shared border, power politics, relations with Russia, with the US, with Turkey, there is I think a public call, deep public call, to have a clearer expression of the democratic will in the outcome of policy decisions. And the system, I guess, resists it because it creates uncertainty. It is at odds with the very strong legal and functionalist working also of the institutions. But what I find interesting, and I will conclude on that for now, is that the public very recently, in the pandemic which we are now experiencing, has in fact found new ways to make its will heard without going via formal routes. But if we think back, well, about 10 months, there was a call for help from Southern Europe, from Italy, from Spain, to Germany in particular, and to the European Union to do something, to act. And this was not about discussion about competences, whether the European Union does or does not have enough to say in the field of public health, but it was just a public call for solidarity, which was so strong that
nobody could resist.
It was so strong, that call, that the most powerful politician of Europe and of the European Union, the German Chancellor, could not resist it. And she had to heed that call. And there, the public, the joint citizens, or a majority of them, have shown that they can really change the direction of where the European Union is going, and something which was not possible 10 years ago. And I was there at the time during the Euro crisis. Yves, thank you for reminding me of that inglorious episode. Whereas now, there is an expression again of public opinion, not directly in the ballot box, but simply in a public sphere which is emerging, changing policies. I think that that's a very fundamental change.
I think, Luuk, you have implicitly underlined a very important factor of democracy building, which is time. There is not a single democracy which is democracy today. We started as a democracy. Even let's say, Britain started as a representative government, France and the United States as republics, not as democracies, as republics. And after all, if I may add a footnote, I don't think the situation is so bad after, let's say, 50 or 60 years of European integration. In particular, if the popular pillar is still too weak, the others are extremely strong. Human rights, rule of law are extremely strong. So I would ask you, perhaps at that point of the debate, had you a suggestion in order to strengthen a democracy in the making? Because from what I hear from all of you is that we might have doubts about the intensity of the democratic character of the European Union, but none of you had doubt about the fact that there are very strong democratic elements, but not enough. You have mentioned one, Luuk, which is the entry, not in the capital, but the entry of the people into the public sphere, into the debate. Nadia, would you have a suggestion, a proposal to make in order to strengthen the democratic character of the European Union?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I see democracy, representative democracy, contemporary democracy, as having two legs. I call it diarchia, because it has two kinds of authorities. One, institutional, making laws according to the tradition, that is a state making, or a sovereignty making, and so on and so forth. The other one, I come from the tradition of Habermas in this case, it is the informal spheres of opinion formation. The question that Habermas gave the sense of informality very strongly. Now we can, and we are invited to, I agree with Luuk, the question of COVID brought this problem to us in front of us, to give this public sphere a more, not structure because it's too much, but certainly an articulation that people can feel to be capable of having a voice to be heard, critical voice, not simply of monitoring the institutions, but giving inputs to the. So what we need, perhaps, it is at the European level, a kind of power. The Romans were so good to create institutions, the ancient Romans, an institution for petitions, a place, a power thanks to which, or because of that, we can have the sense of communication, of making our problems, our means the public, without any specification, nationally speaking, a kind of voice. This, during the COVID, this was held through the governments. Each government of each state was so active in making the voice of their public heard. Perhaps we need at the European level, since we don't have parties or we don't have a strong political organization institutionally, this kind of network of capable of attracting our voice and capable of communicating it to the institution. The internet and the new system of communication may allow this more easily now than in the past. So we have to think in terms of transforming, but insisting on that leg that is not jurisdictionally strong or defined as the leg connected to sovereignty because we don't have it. But the other one can have important articulation and richness, but some institution engineering are needed here.
Yeah, but your comment, Nadia, reminded me that the ancient Greeks in Athens were extremely proud of their political system. And what was making the difference, according to them, that was the fact that people could speak and deliberate, so the Greek problem 5 centuries before Christ is still there. And we have to say that there was an aspiration which is translated into the Lisbon Treaty by the so-called citizens' initiatives, which has been transformed in a bureaucratic nightmare. It does not work. And there are not 2 million different instruments available in order to channel the communication. But certainly that the citizens' initiative, which was a good idea, has been transformed really in a failure through the resistance of governments and institutions. So, but you insist on communication, deliberation, and I think indeed it's quite important. So, Ivan, have you, you are more on the side of liberalism, but have you some proposals to make on the side of the popular expression, which is still lacking?
No, I do believe that there's 3 things which I do believe it's quite important to get why people are becoming so nervous and when the system went in crisis. One is that even when you talk about elections, you can see that last years, you have more and more the spread and the proliferation of a different type of a political protest. You can feel it everywhere. And one of the important things is that what is interesting about the elections is that elections has double role. They're kind of mobilizing the indifferent, but they're also trying to calm down the very committed and intensified. So what elections are not representing in politics is how much people care about certain issue. And from this point of view, paradoxically, and the more you have these one issue movements, one issue kind of stories, which try to make a point that for them, this is life or death issue, be it climate, be it migration, it doesn't matter what it is. But I do believe this representation of passions, not representation of interests, was very much trying to find its way, not so much through deliberation, but through this type of a street politics that is proliferating even when you have the COVID and basically you expect people to stay home. The second thing that I find an interesting paradox is that if you see the history of the European Union for the last 30 years, particularly if you see it from the East, the paradox is that we are getting more and more freedoms, but at the same time, you have the feeling that you are less and less powerful as a voter. And this is real because many of the decisions are taken in a level that basically you cannot affect. And I do believe that this is important to understand that one thing that most of these majoritarian-minded leaders are trying to seduce the voters with is something that is real. They're telling them, listen, look at all these liberal principles, look at the division of powers, look at independent courts, look at independent central banks. They're telling you that nothing could be changed. So in a certain way, the best about liberalism, that when you're losing elections, you're not losing much, is translated as you cannot change much. Your vote does not matter. And I do believe Mr. Kaczynski on this basically even had a kind of an important term that he managed to coin, legal impossibilism. He goes to the voters and said, why are you going to vote for me when I can change nothing? When the independent bank, the courts and the European Union are not going to allow me to be able to deliver to you what I'm promising you. And I do believe this tension is very real. This is very manipulative. because the leaders which are empowering themselves has a very strong message to their voters. If I don't have the power, you don't have the power. And this tension is there. And I do believe this tension is not easy to be resolved simply through consultations, because the idea of the European democracy is democracy without majority. And this is the interesting issue.
This is indeed a constitutive tension of democracies. And I would like to ask Rui, who has disappeared from my screen, but I'm pretty sure he's still there. Rui, you have the experience of as an MEP. What would you suggest in order to improve, let's say, the democratic leg of the system, not the checks and balances leg, but the democratic one? What would you suggest in order to improve things?
Well, thank you, Yves. And now I understand why I was left out of the last round. So I don't know if you allow me just to, before I answer that, just to answer some of the points that Luuk and others made on my initial proposition very quickly, in order to delimit what I intended to say. I don't think that in order for Europe to be a democracy, it needs to be a state. It also does not need emphatically to be a nation. In one sense, that would be the easiest task or mission, you know, the kind of risorgimento question of, we have made Italy, now we have to make Italians, we have made Europe, now we need to make Europeans, and then we will have an European nation state that will be a democracy just like the nation states before it. Well, some federalists and European Republicans, like, for instance, Robert Menasse, the novelist, they do posit that in order for us to have an European democracy, national democracies must die. I emphatically disagree with that. On the contrary, I think that we can only save national democracies if we have, if we democratize the European polity as a polity multinational and shared by many states, as the quote by Voltaire in the Siècle de Louis XIV said. European Republic shared by many states. The national states must not disappear and they must not cease to be democratic, but we do need to rise up to the challenge of creating something new. As you said in one of your questions before, the history of democracy is to democratize what was until now undemocratizable when the founding fathers of the United States created a republic at a multi-state level. Montesquieu told them that a republic could only exist at the city level, and in a nation you had to have a kingdom, and in a multinational setting you had to have an empire. So they created something that was impossible before, and we need to create this new kind of democracy, which is not a state, but a multinational, transnational democracy. Now, for suggestions in order to change that. Here, I think it really comes to the fore the difference in political traditions between the European Council, from where Luuk had his experience, and the European Parliament, where I had mine. Because the European Parliament is not only born out of the experience of Monet and Schuman. I like my Schuman and my Monet and my De Gasperi and Adenauer, but also of Spinelli. The kind of, you know, make democracy first and democracy will create the demos kind of strategy. Go public, do not go step by step, as Schuman said in his declaration, but be bold and first create the movement, and the movement will bring awareness that we need an European polity to solve the kind of large scale problems that we have today. Indeed, without, you know, member states can be all the, you know, majoritarian Democrats that they want, but they will not solve climate change. They will not solve tax evasion at a global level. They will not solve the kind of global problems that we have in the chains of production today. It is quite impossible. Only at the European level, we have a kind of a hope of solving that. So first thing, we have to give people objects of political desire. This is something that is lacking in the European demos. Whereas Americans can have, you know, very different objects of political desire, but they have objects of political desire at the federal level. You know, $15 minimum wage or Medicare for all. We don't have that kind of objects of political desire in Europe. because it is.
Excuse me. I think the European citizens have desires.
Mhm.
But quite often they don't fit with the functional requirements of the so-called constitutions, that is the treaties, because
Yeah. Exactly. So, whereas on one hand, we do have to do some small institution democratic changes, like, electing the president of the commission, or maybe, electing the permanent representatives in the Council of the EU, which would in the end be a senatorialization of the Council of the EU. And this can be done at the national level, like Portugal can decide to elect the permanent representatives, like Oregon did when senators were not elected in the US. But in the last analysis, what we need is to create the public sphere, the European public sphere. Here I agree with all the previous speakers. People need to feel that they have a reasonable possibility of effecting change if they want to. Some people already do that now. If you are a Max Schrems, the young Austrian guy who took Facebook to the European Court of Justice and won, he feels that him alone can affect change. But most of the Europeans don't feel that. So I would, for instance, create places, real brick and mortar agoras in the capitals of Europe in the form of European libraries, where we could have discussions like this, multilingual, with the new technological tools that we'll have in the future, where people can, turbo change that kind of, citizens initiative that you talked about. I will change in the European Parliament. This is quite simple. You have pilot projects that one MEP can present up until 4 million euros. You could change the rule and say that MEPs can present pilot projects, but also 20,000 citizens, which is much more feasible than an initiative with 1 million, can also present a pilot project to the budget committee of the European Parliament, and then it could be implemented. So you need to, by piecemeal change, you need to create several avenues for participation that will give people the notion of their power. Up until now, we have representation without taxation at the EU level. We don't pay European taxes. We do have European representation.
We should.
But maybe we should, because it would give us skin in the game, so to say. But after all this is done, what is still missing is that we don't have pan-European media. We don't have pan-European newspapers. We don't have a pan-European debate. Maybe this will emerge out of the pan-European problems that we do have. But at this point, this is one of the biggest challenge that we have. I will finish with a short story. During the Eurozone crisis, I once caught a cab in Brussels, and the cab driver was very much against the people of the South, like, the lazy, indebted Southerners that are wreaking havoc in the Euro area. And me being a Portuguese, I raised my hand and begged to differ and proceeded to tell him, our side of the story. And then he said, where can I read about that? And I didn't have a question. I didn't have an answer for him, because actually he couldn't. There was no single newspaper or TV channel that he could access in Belgium that would give him the other side of the story. And us in the South, we also did not have the other side of the story. It was all mediated. And this is the big problem, I think.
Yes, there are still a lot of problems and difficulty. But we have heard a few hints at what could be done. And after all, the lessons that we can draw from these various contributions is that we need, as I said, we need time. We need to be quite empirical in what we do. There is not a perfect constitution waiting for us. But before opening the floor to the questions, I would like to ask Luuk if he has one more addition additional contribution to the debate on this point.
No, well, I think I opened the floodgates on the theme of public sphere, which other speakers have picked up. And perhaps this is also the moment for us to open our mini agora we have here in the forms of Q&A or chats or what have we, but so that we have our own mini public sphere with our audience.
Okay.
We can speak for another half an hour, and it would be great to hear the other viewers as well.
I have a question from Christy Landfried, or comment, a colleague from Hamburg. With regard to the criteria of democracy, Nadia rightly mentions the importance of a constitution. The European Council has decided in 2019 there will be a conference on the future of Europe, taking up proposals of Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen. Do you think it would make sense as a follow-up of such a conference to have a new convention or constitution for the EU? So do you think a new convention? By the way, have you heard of anything concerning this conference on the future of Europe?
No.
Nadia?
Well, it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
Well,
they're on the brink of starting it for months now, and I think the project is still to be finished next year under the French 2022 presidency of the Council. So.
Well, no, certainly in moment of crisis, something good can develop, and this could be going back again to this attempt to create or to give us common rules or a basic condition for a noble pact among the many countries or people. Well, can be done, of course. What kind of constitutions, what kind of state organization? Then we are back again to the resuming the issues that was, dropped out several years ago. At least to create a discussion, a general, broad, kind of democratic conventions, broadly speaking, without any formality. I have in mind the Iceland model, in which there was a kind of a mix between formalization, like elections, but also through media or internet or socials, to create together the basic issues for making our rules. This would be and could be perhaps an interesting moment of uplifting the sense of belonging to the same community and give us ourselves some important institutions that allows us to be and to feel more democratic. By the way, if the parliament is our condition, because Europe is a kind of parliamentary democracy as a model, the question would be also to see the relationship in terms of members of parliaments and the commission. There is no obligation now for the member of the commission to come from the parliament. And yet this would be interesting, because if you have the same members of the parliament or the commission to be part of the parliament and thus the institutions of elections would acquire or would have more power. So there are also in this existing situation possible transformation that can strengthen the institutional organization of democracy, which is parliament.
I have also other questions which concur in stating that perhaps should we need some forms of direct democracy within the European Union, which has something which has not been mentioned by anybody actually. Do you exclude legislative initiatives or referenda?
Well, in my view, at least, since I am a little bit, cold in relation to direct democracy, but some form of direct initiative in proposing law proposals, yes, could be an interesting referendum, I don't know, I have some, coming from a country in which the problems exist, I suspend, I don't want to have any kind of final opinion on that. I don't have it, actually.
Yeah.
Can I also make a point on this? Because this is
yes.
interesting. It is very, in my view, risky to have a pan-European referendum in the absence of a European public space where basically people share language and a discussion. Because if you believe that normally people can say only yes and no, you're going to create an instrument that can block certain decisions. I cannot basically see at the same time what kind of a particularly positive agenda it is going to be. And this is something that I'm slightly nervous about in general. The very idea of a democratization of the European Union is perceived as a goal and not as an instrument. And the instrument is that people should feel represented. And part of the story which you have in Europe today is the crisis of the output legitimacy of the democracy. People don't believe that they're getting what they should get. They're unhappy with certain decisions being done. The fact that you're going to give much more participation to the people does not mean that you're going to solve the output legitimacy. And from this point of view, my feeling is that now the elites are very interested to give kind of a much more representation to the people and much more participation, but also as the way to shy away from certain type of responsibility for basically giving them what normally is already in the treaties, that is basically already offered. And this creates a democratization for democratization's sake when it comes to different popular instruments, which people normally are going to like, but not necessary to participate. And this is also my last point on Rui. You said that there is no common European television, newspaper, and you're absolutely right. But even in the United States, where you have a language and they have basically televisions, the story is that you see much more fragmentation of the public space even on the national level. So there is no demand for this type of a social cohesion that we see, and probably we're creating a kind of illusion for our own, believing that the very moment is going to exist, people are going to demand it.
There is a question which is quite important and about the demos. Can a democracy exist without a demos, and most importantly, without a common language? If I may, I would like to perhaps to address this question, because first of all, we have many examples of democracy where there are several languages which are in use. For instance, Switzerland is the case in point. But I have also to say that, first of all, most demos, as we know them today, are historical constructions.
Yeah.
There were very rarely a demos already existing before it has been created, constructed by force in many cases. But I would like also to give an example of how diverse languages could exist within the same polity. There was a study by a British historian sociologist, Zeldin, a study on France at the end of the 19th century. And according to the estimates, the reports of the inspectors of national education, about 70% of the population, of the French population, the most centralized state in Europe, 70% of the population was not speaking French. It was as simple as that. And however, we were living under at the beginning of the Third Republic. So I would not like to make the absence of a strong demos, a preliminary condition for the construction of democracy. There is also another question, and I think I would finish with that questions, which about the debate says, this is assuming perfectly informed and rational citizens and their representatives. What about populism, identity politics, fearful, emotional, reactionary thinking? Yes, we are in immersed in all these patience and identity politics right now. So I think it's Ivan was mentioned the importance of patience, of the street politics. Do you wish to address this question, Ivan?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also want to take the very important point that you're making, and I totally agree with that. All kinds of the demos that we see now were not demos some time ago, and they have been created, and they have been very much created in a certain type of a straight framework. But what is changed is now, strangely enough, people have the idea of what democracy is based on the nation states that they know. It is one thing basically to create a democracy without demos in the 19th century, not having a common language. And it's totally different to believe that you have a model that you know what democracy is about. And I'm saying this because when you see particularly now in Central and Eastern Europe, and there is a lot of talk about the rise of majoritarianism, anti-liberal democracy, and there's very much ethnic understanding of the state. It has a lot to do also with a certain type of demographic changes that we are seeing, which are very much creating and coming with the European Union. We like to talk about how much people have been moving all the time, but what we are not seeing is that in 20th century, people have been moving a lot, but the societies and the states were becoming more and more ethnically homogeneous on the level of the East. The biggest difference now between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is the ethnic composition of societies. And this is part of the paradox that is behind some of these democratic issues that we're talking about. If you look back in the beginning of the 20th century and you see the ethnic map of Europe, you're going to see two Europes. One was multicultural, multi-religious, much more diverse, and it was the Habsburg Europe. And the other was much more kind of ethnically homogeneous, and it was France, it was Germany. Century later, this is just the other way around. And I do believe this kind of identification with ethnicity and democracy, that basically the democracy should belong to a certain ethnic group. I do believe this is an important kind of attention that you can see in Central and Eastern Europe. And from this point of view, when you see it, and we talk about some of these populist governments and regimes, this is kind of certain things that we see also in Israel and other places. You're ready to open society, you're ready to open the market, but you want to be sure that democratic majority is going to be ethnic in its composition. And I do believe this is something that is kind of now creating a huge pressure on the European Union, particularly in a moment in which you have a huge depopulation and loss of population in many parts of the world, and you're going to have a major demographic changes. And I do believe this is, at least of what I'm seeing from the East, is going to be one of the major kind of sources of populist politics and this type of a rise of majoritarianism that you can register, not only in Poland and Hungary, but in many other countries.
Well, perhaps a very last question, and that I will pass to Nadia, because I'm sure she will be pleased to address this question. Is the term representative democracy the dictionary definition of an oxymoron?
Yeah, this, if we assume democracy as the kratos of the demos that does decisions by themselves, of course, this is an oxymoron. It's also the fact that, think about that, democracy is a Greek name, doesn't have a Latin equivalence. Representation is a Latin name, doesn't have a Greek equivalent. So democracy representation is a kind of combination of two systems, Republican and democratic, which were not supposed to be identical, and people over there, they didn't feel that they were identical, and they are, and through the centuries, they've been merged in some sense. So even today, we know that democracy is a monocratic kind of one demos. The republic is two sovereigns, the few and the many, or institutions and the people. So even today. So I think that representation, although oxymoronic from the classical conceptions, it is an important instrument of democratization, particularly beginning with the 17th century. So historically speaking, our modern democracy became a claim for universal suffrage, a claim for constructing representative institutions or parliaments. So we have to consider that democracy has an history, democracy is an history, and if this is the case, historical transformation is part of the game. So yes, of course, in the dictionary is oxymoron, but in the construction of democracy is not. And today we can see that democracy is a system of representation, and representation is a way of interaction, constructions of claims, identities, political identities, kind of, and change. So with the reflection of parties, kinds of, movements, kinds of, in looking for a way of unifying the many, but also pluralizing them. So I think it's a mix of process of unification and process of pluralization. And in this sense, it's our better fit for democracy in today's history.
If I don't know if I can tag along with just one short point. Okay, I think that you have argued, you have pushed back very well against the idea that only if you have a monolingual demos you can have a democracy. We can even turn the argument around. We look at Brazil, which is a monolingual continent country, and the diversity of the social experience between cities and the Amazon in Brazil, it's much wider than the diversity of experience between, you know, Lapland and Lisbon in Europe. So actually there is a great homogeneity of European experience, regardless of the difference in languages. And of course we have India with many languages. But I also want to push back against an argument that Ivan made between input and output legitimacy. I think that the EU actually generates lots of output for the EU citizens. Freedom of movement, single market, the currency in our pocket in certain countries, funds, structural funds, cohesion funds, Erasmus, so on and so forth. The problem is that precisely because you don't have an European democracy, you let national governments define the terms of the debate and kind of erase the experience of the outputs that there is at the EU level. And you know, generating the kind of you know, setup where you can have the Brexit debate, where actually many of the Brits didn't feel that there was an output coming from the EU. So if they didn't feel there was an output on public goods coming from the EU, it was easy for them to destroy it and say, you know, nothing will change. Actually, a lot changes. So if we have a problem is actually in the input side. People need to feel that they have skin in the game, taxes, more representation, more participation. And also a cohesive myth, and with this I'll end. In the 30s, what was really effective against fascism in the United States was the creation of what I would call a para-constitutional idea of the American dream. The American dream is not in the Constitution, is not in the Declaration of Independence, but is in every American citizen's head. There is an American dream.
As would say Barack Obama, a promised land.
And that's where I wanted to get.
Yeah.
We must recreate the idea of an European promise. And we have to go back to history and tell people that when the European promise collapses, bad things happen. And then we will be prepared for a clash of narratives between the populist, the national populist, pessimistic narrative, and an optimistic European narrative of a shared European promise in order to create an European polity that can solve problems at the global level.
Thank you, Rui. I am sorry because I've been rather bad at controlling the time. We were supposed to conclude and to finish by 8:15. It's nearly 1:30. But first of all, I would like to thank all the experts around the table who have discussed the democratic issue at the EU level. It has been an extremely stimulating and fascinating discussion. And I would like also to thank Columbia University, the global centers, Paul LeClerc, who has been the invisible hand behind this organization. So thank you, Nadia, thank you, Rui, thank you, Luuk, thank you, Ivan, thank you, Paul, and see you next time when the pandemic will force us to have another seminar, another discussion. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you all very, very much. You've been a marvelous panel. A deeply, deeply important conversation, I think, on many different fronts. And so all of us at the university, and especially our partners, not only the Global Center in Paris, but our two important partners in organizing and creating this series of 6 debates, the Columbia European Institute and the Alliance program. We're very grateful to you for having given us your time and your genius and your rich thoughts this afternoon. We've had 150 people attending this, this webinar, from people from all around the world, and tomorrow we'll have the breakdown by region, by nation, by continent, and it'll be interesting to see how many different countries within the EU had persons attending us. But we have another one coming up, our 5th, and that will take place on February 9th. The question being debated at that point is there a European identity? Yes or no?
Big question.
So we hope that you'll join us for that, our panelists. And we hope that many, many people from around the world will enjoy that program as well as our final program the month afterwards.
Paul?
Yes.
Yes. I am really very sorry. There are a certain number of questions which have not been addressed. Is there a way of collecting these questions and pass this question to the panelists? They might choose to answer.
I think there must be a way to do that.
Yeah, I don't know, but because I have to apologize, we have still about a dozen of questions which have not been addressed, and it's a pity. Yes.
We have you're absolutely right. We have and that's very gracious on your part. We have a marvelous staff in Paris, and they'll figure out a way of doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Finally, please join us through the Global Center's website to find out much more about what we're doing on a daily and on a weekly basis. And let me conclude by thanking not only our co-founders and co-creators, but a number of other Columbia University entities that are our co-sponsors. And it's a long list, so just let me take a couple of moments to read it. The Columbia Alumni Association, the Columbia Maison Française, the university's libraries, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, the European Legal Studies Center at the Columbia Law School, Le Grand Continent in Paris, La Maison de l'Europe de Paris, and Sciences Po American Foundation, with additional support from the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and the advisory board, the donors of the Paris Global Center. So thanks to them, thanks to you. Thank you for all our participants for coming and joining us this afternoon for this webinar. And we hope to see you all again in the next month for our next program. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.